Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. So if you had a story about being a good man and that you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd actually listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr Ray Swann, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys in the modern world. The series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Hello everyone, today we speak with Dr Simon Rice. Dr Rice is a Senior Research Fellow and Clinical Psychologist. He works for the National Centre of Excellence in Youth Mental Health, which is known as Orygen, and it's the world's leading research and knowledge translation organisation. It has a focus on mental ill health in young people, based in Melbourne. Simon leads the Young Men's Mental Health Research Team, as well as a number of international collaborative research projects. He's also a member of the International Olympic Committee's Elite Athlete Mental Health Consensus Group. Simon was awarded the Australian Psychological Society's Early Career Research Award in 2016. In 2015, he received the Early Career Scholar Award for the Society for Mental Health Research. Welcome, Simon, to the Understanding Boys podcast. It's great to have you back here at the school, and I have an opportunity to talk to you. And some pretty big news for you over summer.
There has been some big news, Ray. It's great to be here talking to the listeners. And the big news is that I have become a dad for the first time, and that's been quite a wild ride and a big adjustment, but a good adjustment. Very welcome.
Fantastic. Tell us a little bit about the story of the day. How did it all go? Was it all, the birth plan, everything went exactly as you thought and, textbook, or was it like for the rest of us a little bit of a make it up as you go along?
It was total chaos. I'd love to say the birth plan went to plan, but it just didn't. So my partner Em's waters broke the day after she wrapped up work, so she didn't get much downtime as part of her maternity leave. And so then she was admitted to hospital, as is pretty normal. But then the birth didn't happen until a couple of days afterwards, and things really started moving about 2 a.m, at which point I was at home asleep.
Right. On
a hot night and the fan running, and I was missing the phone calls from the hospital. So, long story short, they were able to get into my mum. My mum was banging on the window, and I made it with about an hour and a half to spare.
Right, so I love it that mum plays a role in this story.
Yeah.
From a psychological perspective, that's no doubt fascinating as well. Simon, it's great to have you in, and as you know, we're a big admirer of your work, and work obviously as a clinical psychologist and also as a researcher. And what I was hoping to chat to you today about was a few things. Firstly, a bit about your work and what you're seeing, and then talk a bit about the project that we've been working on, the Orygen project, about building a framework for boys and young men in particular. And then in the latter part of our chat today, we'll talk about what is it to be a good man. Perhaps if we just get started with something that happened recently over the weekend. I don't know if you saw in the Australian, they published about the reality that now there's 100,000 young people on antidepressants. It's actually doubled in the last 6 years. I mean, is that something that you're seeing a lot of in your work?
I think we're definitely seeing a massive increase in awareness of mental health in Australia and worldwide, and in general that's an incredibly positive thing. For decades, for generations, there's been a shroud of stigma that has enveloped mental health presentations and how people experience mental health, and that's really been problematic for people feeling comfortable to seek help. And often the help that would have been sought wasn't well attuned to people's needs. So thinking back, it was only a generation and a bit ago that we had institutionalised care for severe presentations of mental health problems, which we know has been problematic for people's recovery. And so we've moved much more towards a positive and recovery-focused model of care. And we're seeing now, with moves around youth mental health, kind of a renewed hope around what can feasibly be expected when young people do experience fairly severe symptoms. Coming back to your question about antidepressants, we know from research literature that there is and there can be a powerful role for medication, but we also know that medications tend to work best when they're in combination with some sort of talking, psychological psychotherapy, so that the young person can also put actual processes in change and feel a bit more empowered and develop their own sets of skills to master the challenges that might be going on for them.
Yeah, great. And I think, obviously schools can play a role in that, and other communities and mentors, as well as, obviously, seeking help with and as you need to. One of the things, I suppose, without being sensationalist about it, but the bit that struck me, I think, as a parent that I was sort of concerned about was, do we think we have enough people helping in this space at the moment? I wondered to myself, in looking at that statistic and with knowing very little about how you would treat something like that, are we seeing more people driven into a medical response in that sense because we don't have enough clinicians and we don't have enough people actually at the front line helping kids?
We probably don't have enough people doing the right kind of work at the right time. So we've got a workforce of experts from different backgrounds, and we've got psychiatrists, we've got general practitioners in the mix, but usually those professionals, those helping professionals, will come into a situation when things are fairly advanced, often, not always, but often around a crisis point, and it just makes intervening a lot more complex at that point. If we were able to have more upstream early intervention and identification services and processes, we would be able to stop things getting to that point. And so we're really trying to get to the stage of, well, what are some of the things that, whether it's schools or workplaces, community groups, sports groups, can be doing to provide more active support that's reasonable and within their means and their skill set, to stop young people kind of heading down a path of functional impairment and problematic symptoms and things like that.
I think you were saying earlier how it's a great thing, and I completely agree that we're becoming much more aware of mental health and how to treat it, and also how to, I guess, come forward and talk about it and normalise that as a way of being. But I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on technology. I know, again, speaking as a dad, seeing how much my son and my daughter and their friends, how much they're online. Does that have an impact on how little that in turn might mean they go outside and get vitamin D and get the sun, or does it keep them up late? Too much blue screen, there's not sleeping as well. Are they being flooded with images of perfection, which could potentially, I guess, lead to feelings of inadequacy because they're seeing so much, through social media and just any news stream, really, just constant bombardment of this is what you should be, when really, I don't think any of us are. Well, I'm certainly not, at that level of whatever. What are your thoughts around that?
There are different schools of thought on this, and it hasn't been conclusively shown one way or the other yet. There are studies that support the use of technology as a potentially beneficial thing in young people's health and mental health and well-being, and there's studies that show the deleterious effect. The view that our research group tends to take is it depends on what you could call the valence, or the nature of the kind of interactions that a young person is getting into. So technology and social media can be good if it's used in a way to promote pro-social, supportive relationships, and like any technology, it can be used for bad if there's cyberbullying or patterns of negative perfectionism and self-comparison and feeling like you don't stack up. So I think part of navigating the process for the young person is for them to feel a bit more empowered and aware of when the use of technology is helpful, when it's neutral, and when it might be unhelpful, and to get some skills into when to dip in and to dip out of it.
It's tricky, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting. I see lots of debate, at a school level about let's ban everything, or let's just, and it's tricky because I get it in the sense that it's the same and can kids self-regulate? Can I self-regulate my own phone usage? I had a look at, the new thing on the iPhone has got how many, I'd like to say minutes per day.
It does,
I use my phone, but it might actually be hours that I'm connected. And I saw last year Common Sense Media put out some research looking at how many hours per day kids are connected. And for the teenager, their figure that they came to, they sampled, I think, around 10,000 kids in the States, and it was 9 hours, which was significant. We can't ignore the reality that's how kids talk to each other these days. It's really, really tricky.
Absolutely. And we also can't ignore the reality of the great social good that has accompanied the use of technology. So when we think about things like, health and medical research, the wealth of knowledge that's available to researchers at the click of a button, whereas I remember in the early days of university going to the library, fishing out articles, photocopying them, like the extraordinary inefficiency in that process, that has been completely revolutionised. So it gives us this, wealth of knowledge at our fingertips, which is a great good.
Let's talk a little bit about the work that we're currently doing in this project, looking at building a framework for young men in particular, by identifying what are some of the things that might be helpful developmentally and the role that a school or a community could play in that. And I guess we look at a school or a community because there's teachers, there's a structure, the kids are there a lot. It seems to make sense to me that it's a good place in that preventative space that we can start to explore. And I think you and I probably almost 2 years ago now looked at it, and there wasn't a lot in terms of leadership. What are some of your thoughts more broadly about that project and how we're how we've started?
Well, the project that Orygen is doing with BGS is a really exciting one. So, as you said, we're looking towards developing a framework for how we can provide a model of positive masculinity and what that can look like for young men at BGS and ideally beyond BGS as well. What we know from the existing academic research literature is that there have been a few programs that have been trialled, but we don't have any robust, super strong data suggesting this is the way to go. So the exciting part of the project is that it genuinely is innovative, and we're having to develop it really as we go. So, looking to experts where we can, looking to get input from the school community, including teachers, including parents, including boys themselves, as to where they see some of the gaps in terms of where they see some of the opportunities, and then putting all of that in the mix with what we do know from the broader, health literature around masculinity and health and mental health, which there is a growing evidence base in that sense. Putting all those factors together to think, well, what can we develop that is genuinely innovative, that will show some leadership in this space and that will improve outcomes both for BGS and beyond.
Great. One of the things that I think we've both wrestled with a little bit, and I'm going to put words in your mouth, so I'll invite you to comment, is just about the notion of gender and how we set up. This is a project around masculinity, boys, adolescent boys, and so on. I guess from a research perspective, talk to us a little bit about, with the caveats that surround the idea of gender, specifically for this project, but why gender can sometimes be a useful way to, think about operationalising, data sets or interventions and so on.
Gender, and in particularly an aspect of gendered behaviour that resonates and is relevant for men, we talk about as masculinity, has become incredibly controversial in the last, probably fair to say, 6 months. Some of that has been born from the work that the American Psychological Association has done on releasing their guidelines for working with men and boys, and the media that's attracted. And there have been some commentators in the media who have interpreted those practice guidelines as being a critique and anti-masculinity or anti-men and boys, and sending a problematic message to the wider community. That's a really simplistic critique. What the guidelines have sought to do is distill what we know from the research literature, which is messy. A construct like masculinity doesn't lend itself to clear and precise measurement.
It doesn't just fit on one point on a scale.
Not really. And unfortunately, so many of our concepts in mental health are like that. To use an analogy, if you're looking at a person, you can probably tell the difference between if they're really ecstatically happy or if they're really angry. That's clear, that's observable, that's a scientific fact. To tell the difference between someone who has a specific anxiety disorder, whether that's an obsessive compulsive disorder, a social anxiety, a specific phobia, in the right context, maybe you might be able to tell that, but more often than not, you can't. We don't have diagnostic tests in the same way that we do for medicine, so that you can go and get a blood test or an x-ray for a broken bone.
That's right, and whether it's morning, evening or lunchtime, you're maybe not blood sugar, but a lot of those constructs are pretty stable. Whereas I guess in mental health, I had a great, I went and swam in the bay this morning. I feel, my overall mood might be low, but I actually feel pretty okay today. It's like it's a better day. And so hard to capture that. Yeah, I get it.
So in the same when it comes to some of these ideas around masculinity, it doesn't mean they're invalid. It just means that they're hard to measure. And so when people start to kind of critique this notion, I think there are a lot of assumptions built into it. So the notion that we shouldn't be thinking about masculinity as potentially problematic to some people is deeply offensive, because it's like, well, you're challenging who I am as a man and you have no right to do that. The research literature that underpins that would say there are particular masculine norms or behaviours that are considered traditionally male that can be really problematic in a health sense, in a mental health sense, in a relationship sense, and that can be bad for society, that can be bad for the individual, that can be bad for families. Not always, but sometimes. So there are a lot of subtleties at play with this work.
And I guess when you start, and I agree, and I think when you see how they're summarised and woven into a narrative that's potentially shaming, I think that's where people can get a little bit frustrated or feel misrepresented, and it wouldn't be an Understanding Boys podcast. We haven't talked ever on a podcast yet about the Gillette ad, so let's give them a little bit more free publicity. But I was very fascinated to see the response to that ad, and it struck me that while some of the various things that are shown in that ad at just a kind of a human being level, they're things that we don't support, and we want to see our men and boys behaving differently to that. I think the response and the negative for that ad was really based around being shamed or being said, well, all men are like this. And that's, I guess, at a teacher level, where I think about working with boys and girls, but, boys in a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment, it's very much about finding a healthy opening to explore what it is to be a good human being, as much as anything else. And having this bombardment of potentially negative images. Again, we're talking earlier about the amount of time kids are online and seeing this stuff. I worry that some of the untalked about or non-discussed, that these things will go underground and it'll be a source of confusion and frustration, and potentially a contributor to mental health potentially down the track.
I think what has happened off the back of Gillette's advertisement and the guidelines around working with men and boys has been, in a sense, divisive, but also in a sense fantastic. And while there are fairly entrenched positions on all sides of that debate, I think it's a healthy thing that people are starting to critique it a little bit more, because hopefully we will start to get to a point of a little bit more precision in people's language and their understanding, because a lot of it is born out of misunderstanding.
Do you think it's too simplistic to summarise some of the debate and say, in terms of the traditional male, cultural male, the idea that we don't talk about our emotions and we don't talk and we don't help each other to unpack things and stand side by side and be okay with being a bit vulnerable and be okay with shedding tears of joy or sadness, is it just too simplistic to say that if we were to look at an overall umbrella term, they're, for the greater part, generalisation, it's a bit of a summary of the challenge of the traditional masculine?
The idea that and perhaps that's where things have become problematic, the use of the word traditional, because I think some people have aligned that with I embody older or conservative views, therefore you're criticising me as a man. And I think that the term traditional probably needs a little bit more precision around it as well. So what we do know from the research literature is that if a male is more likely to be stoic in all situations in their life, they have a much higher risk of experiencing suicidal ideation and more adverse outcomes in terms of their physical and mental health. Does that mean stoicism is a bad thing? Not necessarily. There are points where it's an incredibly beneficial characteristic. And if you are in the Defence Force in active combat, of course you need to embody the stoicism to its nth degree.
Perhaps for the listeners, if you just give us a short explanation of what you mean by being stoic.
Yeah, so stoicism is that notion that you need to handle problems on your own, that you need to manage things independently. If I've got something going on emotionally, I don't talk about that, I'll suppress that. And as I said, there are points in life where those characteristics can be really good. There are points in life when they can be really problematic. And knowing when it might be good to switch it on and switch it off so that it works better for you. Really, this is about trying to empower men to lead healthier, happier lives. It's not about trying to deconstruct and damage men and take all forms of power away.
Yeah, and I think we also honour stoicism in men. You know, we I think as a culture, you know, we admire that, you know, someone who can never explain, never complain, as a way of being sometimes, and understand how that can help the community, that someone can be someone who carries the burden of you know, an event, or can be someone who has chaperoned others through trauma and so on in a very brave way. And I think that's a mixed message, I think, for young people, because they don't know how to, well, don't you want me to be strong in this, and don't you want me to find a way of not just crying all the time because this is a terrible thing, I've just lost a parent and I just, you know, I can barely function. And you're telling me on one hand I've got to man up and go to school or work and just get on with life, and, you know, there'll be times in the day, maybe just 2 in my day, where I'm actually not thinking about this. It's really tricky. It's really hard.
Yeah, I completely agree. The mixed messaging aspect of it, I think, confounds people at times. So in some of the work that we do at Orygen, we consult to elite sports groups, and elite sport is really tuning into mental health at the moment. I guess they see mental health as being a bit of an untapped domain, very much related to performance and potentially to physical health. But one of the things that they're struggling with is the messaging. How do you give the message to an elite performer who might be running out into a stadium of 95,000 people? We want you to embody the best warrior-esque characteristics that you possibly can. But then when you come off at halftime or after the game or during the week, if you've got stuff going on emotionally, please talk to us about it. They're very contradictory things.
Yeah, absolutely. The last time I was on the MCG with 80,000 people was at the Eminem concert, and I can assure you there wasn't a lot of stoicism going on, funnily enough. The other people that were on the ground amongst the 80,000 as well, it was a bit more, I think, like what the ancient Greeks might refer to as cathartic dithyramb of, you know, dancing and whatever, which was also fantastic. And
Eminem brings his own kind of masculinity.
He does, he does. Yeah, and that's also interesting, isn't it, in the sense of who he is and what he talks about, and the kinds of people that are attracted to that as well.
Interesting side note, there's some fantastic footage of him in the Dr Ray and Jimmy Iovine documentary. He kind of talking about his relationship to Dr Dre and how formative Dre was in championing his music, and Dre really bet the house on Eminem, and it paid off, but it might have gone otherwise, and yeah, he's got some interesting things to say about that.
I just want to take you back a little bit to we were talking about stoicism before. Something I learned from you last year in the work was around the idea of precarious masculinity, and you know, in short, what I took from, you know, reading the things that you'd sent and exploring that as an idea was that you know, masculinity for some men is something that you need to kind of reprove and re-demonstrate, or that there's no sort of fixed point where you feel like, I'm an adult now. and that through that we see adolescent boys in particular kind of reproving, and also older men as well, reproving that I'm a man, and that sometimes in the proving of it, the kinds of behaviours and risk-taking that go on with that aren't very pro-social or pro-health, for that matter. I found that a really fascinating area, and it really helped in my thinking, as a teacher and working with boys, just observing that and where we're stepping up and what kinds of unspoken values are privileged in that space. What's your take on a precarious masculinity?
Yeah, so the precarious masculinity construct is a really interesting one, and in particular because that has been demonstrated in an empirical, experimental sense. So I guess it gives it a greater sort of sense of robustness around the scientific evidence. In a nutshell, what it's trying to get across is this idea that manhood and being labelled a man or a self-identity as having a manhood notion about yourself isn't fixed. It's something that is demonstrated to others, and it's earned by either feedback that's received or a sense of self-accomplishment within an individual's man's sense of self. That's in deep contrast to the sense or the state of femininity, which does tend to be a fixed state, or womanhood at a particular developmental age. There are biological things that happen, and that tends to mark the transition to womanhood. Manhood is much more diffuse. They've kind of surmised over a series of studies that this state of manhood and this kind of self-identification is something that is hard won but easily lost and needs to be repeatedly reproven, which is interesting to think about, because if it's not fixed, if manhood is something that needs to be consistently demonstrated, then there can be potential problems with a man feeling like they don't have a sense of manhood and what they might potentially enact out to regain
need
that.
To do.
That's right. Yep.
Do you think that there is a link in terms of what we were talking about earlier in shame, that if I'm not a man, then that somehow I'm lesser in terms of status, or in terms of, I guess, a social hierarchy, and feeling a sense of, we know from the positive education research, having a sense of purpose and engagement, and a sense of I belong in this community and so on. I wonder if there's a mix in that space, not being as familiar with the research.
I think we're still very much kind of at base camp around some of these concepts and how they play out, and the helpful or the damaging aspects of that, and how we need to manage it. I think we've got a lot to learn.
Great. So we're heading into that section now to talk about, and we've kind of covered the ground a little bit in terms of what are some of the things it is to be a good man these days. Yeah,
I mean, that's a really
big question.
That's a really interesting question, and again, that's not necessarily fixed. That's going to be, an individual question for any given young man, for any man, and what they value and what the characteristics are that they want to pursue and develop in themselves.
But what about for you, Simon? I mean, to personalise it a little bit, are there men, like if I said to you, what is a good man? Are there men that you've known that somehow, embody what it seems to be a decent, and it's probably a decent person as much as anything else? Do you think of people or experiences where you've kind of observed that in others? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that would be true of almost everyone in our societies. And I guess people, to varying degrees, are lucky enough to come in contact with really powerful mentors. And for men, a mentor doesn't just have to be a male. And that's not necessarily the case at all. And I think it's also true that people display a range of characteristics, and so in some environments you might say that an individual is not a particularly good ambassador, role model, mentor, but in other environments they're fantastic. So I think once again that is a little bit complex, but I guess thinking back to my own experiences of men who have been powerful in shaping the views that I guess embody as being important as a human being, have been men that have been able to have some variation in their kind of, I guess to use a sciencey word, behavioural repertoire to a particular given situation, so that they don't just have to act with anger. They can act with anger, but they can also engage, rationality, and they can also be very caring, and they can also be incredibly sensitive and emote in appropriate situations. They give themselves permission to feel things, to acknowledge things, and that, I think, is often a really helpful process in managing difficult situations, and the kind of the one-size-fits-all kind of masculinity around you suppress anything that's negative or anything that kind of veers into an unhelpful domain. It's just problematic.
Just you were saying about appropriately aggressive. I was thinking another word for that could be assertive, and I was thinking about how we teach kids in social emotional realms about how to be assertive and be respectful and find that balance. And I see a lot with boys in particular, when they line up outside the classroom, they're jostling, like they're physically, literally bumping into each other, like where's the boundary? Yep. And then that translates into boundary testing in the adolescence, and finding out, well, how do I be assertive? Where's the line? How do I manage that? Because to be healthy, we need people to understand the power they have within themselves, but also how to enable voice and power in other people, so that as good men they can provide the kinds of communities and opportunities for other people to be able to speak and to be able to be heard, but also how to redirect things when they're negative, or when they're really unhelpful or toxic, or dangerous as well. Just to round things out, I'd like to ask people if you had a story or a message that was received and could be received, like in the Matrix, we could just implant. No, not to that level. If you could give someone a message, a young boy, 12 to 14 sort of age group, a message or a story, what would that story be?
That's a really interesting question. And in this moment, I'm kind of thinking back to when I was that age. And I think what would have been really beneficial for me to hear then is that whatever's going on in your life, whatever are the predominant, whether it's thought patterns or themes, you're not locked into those. There is phenomenal opportunity to grow and to develop and to have other broader experiences as a human being. And I guess that having the courage to be receptive to those things. There are moments in life where opportunities present and people can feel, young men, boys, can feel overwhelmed, or it's not the right thing, and that's fine. You've got it. There's a place and there's a role for trusting your gut and trusting your intuition on things. But there's also a place to rationally think, hang on, what could this opportunity or possibility lead to, and maybe having the courage to take a step into something that might be, whether it's going against the grain or pushing you way beyond mediocrity. I guess there could be a range of things, but having the perspective to take that chance, I think I'd encourage that 12, 13, 14-year-old to think about that.
Yeah, beautiful. Take a step, take a chance. I love it. Thank you so much for joining me today in this discussion. We're big admirers of your work and the way in which you work and bring people together and simplify sometimes the quite difficult research evidence into a way that's both eloquent, interesting, and also, I think, accessible. And hopefully our listeners have had a bit of a taste of that. And if we wanted them to go and read more or see or follow some things up, there'll obviously be some links below in the on the website. But is there anything else, Simon, from your perspective, that if people were interested, they could jump online and read more? Yeah,
look, there's lots of things happening in the space. We at Orygen, the National Centre of Excellence in Youth Mental Health, have been doing some work and are growing our research area into young men's mental health. It's funny, there's not many people doing this work internationally. We're trying to build a community of interested people and researchers who are wanting to further scholarship and not just scholarship for scholarship's sake, but also change outcomes and really improve things. So if people are interested, I encourage them to reach out and I can make some connections.
Great. I was going to say Washington. That's got road trip written all over it, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ray.
Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app. And please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.